The rain drummed softly against the windows, a steady, rhythmic sound that usually lulled Mia into a sense of calm. But tonight it felt different, almost like a warning. She sat at her kitchen table, a steaming mug of tea cradled between her hands, as she absent-mindedly scanned the local classifieds on her phone. She had been up for hours, unable to sleep, her mind plagued by the same restless energy that had been keeping her awake for weeks. It was around 2 a.m. when her eyes landed on an ad that caught her attention. Antique mirror for sale. Ornate full-length mirror. Gothic style. Hand-carved. Perfect condition. Urgent sale. Something about it intrigued her. Mia had always been drawn to antiques, a trait she inherited from her grandmother. After inheriting the old family house, she had started selling vintage pieces online as a side business, a way to make ends meet while indulging in her passion for old things. There was something enchanting about objects with history, as if they held whispers of the past in their cracks and crevices. She hesitated for only a moment before tapping on the ad. The photo showed a tall, imposing mirror with an intricately carved wooden frame. The design was almost unsettling, with twisted vines, grimacing faces, and strange symbols woven into the wood. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, both beautiful and vaguely sinister. The seller's message was short and to the point, with a single, almost desperate line at the end. "Please take it off my hands as soon as possible." Curiosity piqued. Mia sent a quick message expressing her interest. She didn't expect a reply so late at night, but within minutes her phone buzzed with a response. "If you can come by tomorrow, it's yours for half the price. Just please come quickly." The next morning, Mia found herself driving to a part of town she rarely visited, a neighborhood of aging houses and narrow, winding streets. The house she pulled up to was old, its once bright paint peeling and the garden overgrown. The door opened before she even reached the porch, and an elderly woman stepped out, peering at Mia with a kind of nervous eagerness. "You must be Mia," the woman said, her voice thin and raspy, as if she hadn't spoken in a while. "I'm Evelyn. Thank you for coming. It's inside." Evelyn led Mia through a dimly lit hallway and into a parlor filled with clutter. Old books, dusty knickknacks, and faded photographs covered every available surface, but at the center of the room, dominating everything else, stood the mirror. In person, it was even more imposing than in the photograph. The frame was dark, almost black, and the carvings seemed to shift in the low light, like shadows creeping over the wood. Mia felt a chill as she approached it. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the reflection, but when she blinked, it was gone. Just her own face staring back, looking pale and tired. "Are you sure you want to sell this?" Mia asked, glancing at Evelyn. The old woman's eyes darted around nervously, avoiding the mirror's reflection. "It's a beautiful piece. Must be worth a lot more." "I need it gone," Evelyn said, her tone abrupt. "I can't. I don't want it in my house anymore. It's yours if you want it. Take it. I'll even arrange for delivery." She hesitated, her lips trembling as if she was about to say something more, but then she just nodded, as if convincing herself it was the right thing to do. "Just don't keep it too close to your bed. Trust me on that." Mia laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. "Okay, sure. I'll find a good spot for it." Evelyn's expression softened, a mix of relief and sadness, and for a moment it looked like she might cry, but she just gave a small, strained smile. "Take care, Mia, and if anything strange happens, don't look too long." The mirror was delivered later that afternoon, carried in by two movers who grumbled about its weight and size. Mia directed them to place it in the hallway, just outside her bedroom. She figured it would be a striking feature, something that would draw the eye. She liked the idea of having a piece of history so close, something that had seen things, that had been part of other lives. The first night, Mia couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the strange interaction with Evelyn over and over. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that there was something off about the whole encounter. The way Evelyn had seemed almost afraid. But it was just a mirror, a piece of glass in a wooden frame. What was there to be scared of? Around 3 a.m., she heard it for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. Mia sat up in bed, straining to hear, but there was nothing. Just the usual creaks and groans of an old house. She tried to convince herself it was just the wind, but the sound had been so close, as if someone was standing just outside her bedroom door, whispering through the crack. She got up, pulling on a sweater, and slowly opened the door, peering into the dark hallway. The mirror stood there, silent and still, its surface reflecting the faint glow of the moon filtering in through the window. Mia's reflection stared back at her, slightly distorted in the dim light. She reached out and touched the frame, tracing her fingers over the carvings, feeling the grooves and ridges beneath her skin. For a moment, she thought she heard it again. A low, murmuring sound, like a voice trying to form words, but it was so faint she couldn't make out what it was saying. She leaned in closer, her breath fogging up the glass. The whisper came again, louder this time, and Mia's heart skipped a beat as she caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror's depths. Not her own reflection, but something else, shifting just beyond the surface, like a shadow swimming beneath dark water. She stumbled back, her pulse quickening, but when she looked again, it was gone. Just her own face, wide-eyed and pale, staring back at her. Mia stood there for a long moment, her mind racing. She told herself she was just tired, that she was imagining things. But as she turned to go back to bed, she could have sworn she saw her reflection smile, just for a fraction of a second, even though her lips hadn't moved. The next few days passed in a haze. Mia tried to go about her usual routine, but she found herself constantly drawn to the mirror as if it was calling to her. She would catch herself staring at it, her thoughts drifting, only to snap back and realize she had been standing there for minutes, sometimes hours, without even noticing. The whispers came more frequently now, always just on the edge of hearing, like voices muffled by a heavy blanket. One evening, as she was locking up for the night, she glanced at the mirror and saw something that made her blood run cold. Her reflection was there, but it wasn't right. The eyes were darker, the pupils too large, and the expression was one she didn't recognize, a twisted, almost mocking smile that made her feel sick to her stomach. She blinked, and it was gone, her own confused and frightened face staring back at her. Mia tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. She was starting to understand why Evelyn had been so desperate to get rid of it. There was something wrong with this mirror, something that she couldn't quite explain, but it was as if the air around it was different, heavier. And no matter where she stood, she always felt like she was being watched. That night, she covered the mirror with a sheet, but even in the dark, she could still hear the whispers. Mia was tired. She had been tired for weeks now, her nights plagued by nightmares that seemed to melt into her waking hours. Every time she closed her eyes, she would see the mirror, dark and looming, with shadows shifting just beneath the surface. The whispers had become a near-constant presence, sometimes barely audible, like a breath against her ear, other times loud and clear, as if someone was standing right behind her, muttering words she couldn't quite understand. She had tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it was just stress, or maybe the isolation of living alone in the old house. But the feeling had only grown stronger, a creeping dread that gnawed at her, making her skin prickle whenever she was near the mirror. The final straw came one night when she woke to find herself standing in front of it, the sheet she had used to cover it lying crumpled at her feet. She didn't remember getting up. She didn't remember pulling the sheet off. But there she was, staring at her reflection, which stared back at her with a knowing, almost taunting expression. That was when she decided she needed answers. The next morning, Mia drove to the local library, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she needed to know more about the mirror, to understand why it seemed to have such a hold on her. The librarian, a quiet woman with graying hair and a kind smile, guided her to the archives and left her to sift through old records, newspapers, and dusty books. It took hours of searching, but eventually, Mia found something. A yellowed newspaper clipping from the early 1900s. The headline read, "Famed occultist Adrian Blackwood found dead in manor, surrounded by mirrors." The article described how Blackwood, a prominent figure in occult circles during the late 19th century, had been found dead in his home under mysterious circumstances. He had been an eccentric, known for his interest in dark rituals and ancient symbols, and his death had only fueled rumors about his supposed dabbling in forbidden magic. According to the article, Blackwood's body was discovered in a room filled with mirrors, all positioned to reflect each other, creating an endless loop of reflections. The police report mentioned signs of self-inflicted wounds and strange symbols carved into the wooden frames, but no definitive cause of death was ever determined. Mia's heart skipped a beat as she read on, her eyes widening when she saw a description of one of the mirrors found at the scene. A large, ornate mirror with a dark wooden frame, carved with intricate patterns and symbols. The description was almost identical to the mirror that now sat in her hallway, the same mirror that had been haunting her for weeks. She quickly jotted down the details, her mind racing. She needed to know more. If this mirror had been in Blackwood's possession, there had to be a record of it somewhere. She asked the librarian if there were any books on Blackwood, and after a moment of hesitation, the woman led her to a section on the occult, pulling down a heavy leather-bound book titled "The Dark Arts and Their Practitioners." The book was dense, filled with old, faded photographs and detailed descriptions of various rituals and the people who performed them. It wasn't until she was nearly halfway through that Mia found a chapter dedicated to Adrian Blackwood. The text described him as a brilliant but disturbed man who became obsessed with the idea of binding the soul to glass. He believed that mirrors were portals, gateways to another world, and that through them he could communicate with entities that existed beyond the veil of reality. Mia's skin crawled as she read about his experiments, which ranged from scrying, a form of divination using mirrors, to complex rituals that supposedly allowed him to trap spirits within reflective surfaces. According to the book, Blackwood had gone mad in his final years, claiming that something had come through the mirror, something that was trying to take him. The last entry in his personal journal, quoted in the book, sent a chill down Mia's spine. "The glass calls to me. I can see it watching, always watching. I thought I could control it, but it is stronger than I am. It whispers to me, and I fear I no longer understand where I end, and it begins. I am trapped, bound, but so is it, and it is hungry." Mia's head was spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was following in Blackwood's footsteps, that she had stumbled into something far darker than she could comprehend. She had to know more, but she didn't want to be alone in the house with that mirror. The librarian, noticing her distress, suggested she visit a small, obscure museum on the outskirts of town. It specialized in local folklore and occult artifacts, and they might have more information on Blackwood and his strange obsession. The museum was a grim, unwelcoming place, filled with dusty relics and eerie displays. Mia felt a shiver run down her spine as she walked through the dimly lit halls, past glass cases containing old, rusted tools, preserved animal bones, and faded photographs of people who all seemed to be staring directly at her. She finally found what she was looking for in a small room at the back of the museum, a display titled "The Mirrors of Adrian Blackwood." The curator, an elderly man with a stooped posture and watery blue eyes, approached her as she stared at the display. "You're interested in Blackwood, I see," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Not many people are. Most find his story unsettling." "I need to know about his mirrors," Mia said, trying to keep the urgency out of her voice, "especially the one with the carved frame. I think I might have it." The curator's expression changed, his eyes widening slightly. "If you have Blackwood's mirror," he said slowly, "you should get rid of it. Destroy it if you can. That mirror is not safe." "What do you mean?" Mia asked, her pulse quickening. "Why isn't it safe?" The curator hesitated, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. Blackwood believed that mirrors were windows to the other side, but more than that, he thought he could bind spirits to them, use them as vessels. He performed rituals, dark and twisted, to trap things in the glass. But he made a mistake. He didn't just trap spirits. He trapped himself. Mia felt a chill wash over her. Trapped himself? You mean his spirit? "Not exactly," the curator said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Blackwood was trying to summon something, a being from beyond our world, but it turned against him, and in his desperation, he tried to bind it to the mirror. Instead, it bound him, trapped him in the glass along with it. That mirror is a prison, and whatever is inside it wants out." Mia's stomach churned as she remembered the way her reflection had smiled at her, the whispers that seemed to come from just beyond the surface of the glass. Is there a way to break the connection? To stop it? The curator shook his head slowly. "No one knows. Some say breaking the mirror will release whatever's inside. Others say it will make things worse. But Blackwood's journals, the originals, not the excerpts you read, might have answers. They were auctioned off decades ago, scattered across collections. But if you can find them, maybe there's still a way to stop this." Mia left the museum with a feeling of dread twisting in her gut. She had come looking for answers, but all she had found were more questions, each one darker than the last. As she drove home, she couldn't help but glance nervously at the rearview mirror. half expecting to see something other than her own eyes staring back at her. When she arrived back at her house, the hallway was quiet, the mirror still covered with the sheet she had hastily thrown over it. She hesitated before pulling the cover off, her hands trembling. For a moment she saw nothing but her own reflection, tired and weary. But then the whispers started again, louder this time, and she could swear she saw something flicker in the corner of the glass, a shadow darting across her reflection's eyes. She stepped back, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she was dealing with, but she knew she couldn't run from it. Not anymore. The mirror was a prison, yes. But for who? And more importantly, for what? As Mia stood there, staring into the dark, swirling depths of the glass, she realized she had to find Blackwood's journals. It was the only way to understand what she was up against. But deep down, she was beginning to fear that whatever Blackwood had summoned, whatever he had tried to bind to that mirror, had already started to slip through the cracks. And she was beginning to understand why Evelyn had been so eager to get rid of it. Mia's hands trembled as she flipped through the old, brittle pages of Adrian Blackwood's journal. She had spent weeks scouring auction sites, antique shops, and online forums, following every tenuous lead she could find. It was as if the journals themselves didn't want to be found, hidden away, forgotten. But now, at last, she had managed to piece together several volumes, and as she read, the weight of what she was discovering crushed down on her, suffocating her like a heavy fog. The journals detailed Blackwood's descent into madness, but beneath the ramblings and arcane symbols, there was a pattern, a twisted logic that Mia could almost grasp. He had been obsessed with mirrors, seeing them as portals, not just to another world, but to the hidden depths of the soul. They were conduits, he believed, between the living and the unseen, between the physical and the spiritual. Blackwood's writings were filled with incantations and rituals, diagrams of complex sigils, and instructions on how to bind and harness the energies that reside within the glass. But there were darker passages too, ones that hinted at his failure, at something he had let slip through. Mia read one passage over and over, unable to tear her eyes away from the words. "I thought I could control it. I was wrong. It is not a spirit. It is not of this world. It is a shadow that wears faces, that speaks with voices that do not belong to it. And now it is in the glass, whispering, waiting, watching." Mia shivered. She knew those whispers all too well. Over the next few days, Mia's world began to unravel. Her once quiet house felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to emanate from the mirror, radiating outwards like ripples in a still pond. She started to hear the whispers more clearly now, no longer muffled and distant, but distinct and sharp, as if someone was speaking directly into her ear. Sometimes she would hear her own name, repeated over and over, in a voice that was almost, but not quite, her own. She tried to avoid the mirror, but it was impossible. No matter where she went, no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, she would find herself drawn back to it, her feet carrying her to the hallway without her even realizing it. She would stand there, staring at her reflection, her mind blank until she snapped out of it, hours having passed without her noticing. She started to lose track of time, of days, of where she was and what she was doing. It was as if the mirror was pulling her deeper into its grip, dragging her down into a place where reality twisted and fractured. Her reflection began to change too. It wasn't just the occasional flicker anymore, a fleeting glimpse of something not quite right. Now she could see it, clear as day, staring back at her with eyes that were too dark, too hollow. Sometimes it would smile, a slow, crooked grin that made her skin crawl. Other times it would mouth words that she couldn't hear, but she could see the shape of them, and she knew they were wrong. Once she watched in horror as her reflection raised a hand to her face and slowly dragged its nails down its cheek, leaving deep, jagged lines, while her own face remained still and untouched. Mia's mind was slipping, unraveling thread by thread. She would wake up in strange places with no memory of how she had gotten there. One night, she found herself standing outside in the cold, barefoot, with no recollection of leaving the house. Another time, she woke up to find her hands covered in blood, her fingernails broken and raw, with deep scratches carved into the walls of her bedroom. She couldn't remember doing it, but she knew it had been her, and that terrified her more than anything. Desperate for help, Mia reached out to the occult expert she had contacted before, a man named Dr. Alan Prescott. He was reluctant at first, his voice tight and hesitant over the phone, but when Mia described the mirror and what she had been experiencing, he agreed to come to the house. Dr. Prescott arrived on a gray, rainy afternoon, his eyes wary as he stepped through the front door. He was a thin, middle-aged man with a lined face and a nervous energy, like someone who had seen too much and was constantly waiting for the next bad thing to happen. He listened as Mia explained everything: the whispers, the reflections, the strange, shifting shadows. And the more she talked, the more he seemed to tense, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "This is worse than I thought," he said finally, his voice low. "I've heard of mirrors being used as conduits, but this is something else. Blackwood didn't just open a door. He broke something. And whatever he was trying to bind, it's using the mirror as a way to reach out, to manipulate you." Mia's heart pounded in her chest. "How do I stop it?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "How do I get rid of it?" Dr. Prescott hesitated, glancing at the mirror, which was still covered by the sheet, its dark, looming shape barely visible in the dim light. "I don't know if you can," he said. "Blackwood's journals might hold the key, but from what you've described, it sounds like the entity has already established a connection with you. Breaking the mirror could sever that link, or it could release it." That night, Mia dreamed of the mirror. She was standing in front of it, but this time, she was not alone. A figure stood beside her, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. She couldn't see its eyes, but she could feel them, cold and sharp, boring into her, dissecting her. It spoke, its voice low and raspy, like dry leaves scraping against stone, but she couldn't understand the words. The figure raised a hand, and she watched as her reflection mirrored the movement, reaching out towards the glass. The reflection's hand pressed against the surface, and then, slowly, the fingers began to sink into the glass, as if it were liquid. Mia's heart pounded as she watched the hand disappear, followed by the arm, until the reflection was gone, leaving only darkness behind. She tried to pull away, but she couldn't move, her feet rooted to the spot, her body heavy and numb. The whispers rose around her, louder now, overlapping, voices twisting and writhing like a mass of wriggling worms. When she woke, she found herself standing in the hallway, facing the mirror. The sheet had been pulled off, lying crumpled on the floor, and her reflection was staring at her, a slow, cruel smile spreading across its lips. Mia stumbled back, her head spinning, her throat tight with terror. She could still feel the cold, slick sensation of the glass against her skin, even though she hadn't touched it. She couldn't live like this. She needed to do something, anything, to break the mirror's hold over her. She spent the next few days poring over Blackwood's journals, searching for some way to sever the connection, to escape the mirror's influence. She barely ate, barely slept, her eyes red and swollen from lack of rest. She felt like she was coming apart at the seams, her thoughts fraying and tangling, slipping through her fingers like sand. And then she found it, a passage in one of the journals, almost hidden among the incoherent scrawlings and fragmented symbols. It described a ritual, a way to bind the mirror, to trap whatever was inside and seal it away. But it was dangerous, the text warned, and if done incorrectly, it could make things worse. The ritual required blood, the blood of the one bound, and a mirror not to be destroyed but to be sealed, to become a barrier between worlds. Mia's hands shook as she read the instructions, the words blurring on the page. She didn't know if she could do it, if she was strong enough, but she had no other choice. She was losing herself, bit by bit, and if she didn't act, she would be gone, and something else would take her place. On the night of the ritual, the house was silent, the air heavy and oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Mia stood in front of the mirror, her hands shaking as she held a small, silver knife. The whispers had grown louder, filling the room, drowning out her thoughts. But she tried to focus, to remember the words she had memorized from the journal. She could feel the mirror's pull, a dark, yawning presence that tugged at the edges of her mind, threatening to swallow her whole. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and pressed the blade against her palm. Pain flared as the skin broke, blood welling up, warm and slick. She watched as it dripped down, splattering against the glass, the drops spreading out in dark, jagged lines. The mirror seemed to shudder, the surface rippling, and for a moment she thought she saw her reflection flicker, shifting into something else, a dark, twisted shape with eyes like empty voids. Mia began to chant, her voice trembling, the words unfamiliar and strange on her tongue. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows thickening, pressing against her skin. She could feel the mirror resisting, could feel the presence inside it writhing, trying to push back. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. As she spoke the final words, the glass cracked, a thin, jagged line splitting the surface. Mia's reflection shattered, fragments scattering, and for a moment she saw something moving behind the shards, a dark, writhing mass like a swarm of insects, shifting and coiling. Then everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the shadows receded, and Mia was left standing in the dark, her breath ragged, the mirror still and cold, its surface marred by a single jagged crack. She didn't know if it had worked. She didn't know if she had succeeded, or if she had only made things worse. But as she looked into the cracked glass, she saw her reflection staring back at her, and for the first time it looked different, darker, almost relieved. Mia stumbled back, a scream clawing its way up her throat, but she couldn't make a sound. The reflection smiled, a slow, creeping grin, and whispered, in a voice that was almost her own, "It's not over yet." The house felt different now, as if it had exhaled a long-held breath, leaving behind an eerie stillness that clung to the walls like a shroud. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was worse, heavy and suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Mia moved through the rooms like a ghost, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes flicking nervously to every reflective surface. She had thought the ritual would end it. She had thought the crack in the mirror meant she had succeeded, that she had severed the connection and banished whatever was inside. But she was wrong. She could feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, a dark presence that coiled and twisted, waiting for its moment to strike. And she knew deep down that her reflection wasn't really hers anymore. The journal's final pages had been cryptic, but clear enough to send a chill down her spine. There was still one last ritual, a ritual of release, as Blackwood had called it. It was meant to seal the mirror forever, to bind whatever was inside and prevent it from ever reaching through the glass again. But it was dangerous, a final gambit that required more than just blood. It demanded something deeper, something primal. It demanded a sacrifice. Mia had spent the last 2 days preparing, gathering the things she would need: candles, black salt, a bowl of water, and a vial of crimson liquid, a tincture mixed from herbs and her own blood, as Blackwood had described. She set everything up in the living room, clearing a space in the center of the floor. The mirror stood before her, its crack now wider, spiderwebbing across the surface, distorting her reflection. She had draped the rest of the mirrors in the house with cloths, unwilling to see her own face twisted and wrong. But this one she left uncovered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mia knelt in front of the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the fear creeping up her spine, cold and sharp. But she pushed it down, forcing herself to focus. She had no other choice. She had come too far to back out now. She lit the candles, placing them in a circle around her, their flickering flames casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The air was thick with the scent of burning wax and herbs, and as she closed her eyes, she could almost hear the faintest whisper of a voice, echoing from somewhere deep inside the mirror. She picked up the vial, uncorked it, and let a few drops fall into the bowl of water. The liquid rippled, dark and viscous, swirling as if stirred by an invisible hand. "Speak, and it will listen," Blackwood had written. "But be careful, for it knows your voice now, and it will use it against you." Mia began to chant, her voice low and steady, reciting the incantation she had memorized from the journal. The words felt heavy on her tongue, ancient and unnatural, as if they didn't belong in her mouth. The shadows around her seemed to shift and stretch, crawling across the floor, reaching out towards the mirror. She could feel the energy in the room building, a crackling tension that made her skin prickle, and the air grew colder, biting against her cheeks. As she spoke, the crack in the mirror began to widen, slowly at first, then faster, until it stretched across the entire surface, splintering her reflection into 1,000 jagged pieces. But the shards didn't fall. Instead, they seemed to float, suspended in midair, shimmering like fractured ice. And through the cracks, Mia could see something moving, a dark, sinuous shape slithering beneath the surface like a serpent coiling in the shadows. The candles flickered, their flames sputtering, and the room was plunged into near darkness. Mia's chant wavered, but she forced herself to keep going, even as she felt the presence behind the glass growing stronger, pushing against the barrier, trying to break through. Her voice grew louder, more desperate, as she reached the final verse, the one that would seal the mirror forever. "Begone and be bound. Let this glass be your prison. Let this reflection be your tomb." For a moment, the room was silent, the words hanging in the air, and Mia thought she had done it. But then she heard it, a slow, mocking laugh, soft and cold, curling around her like smoke. She looked up and her breath caught in her throat. Her reflection was no longer hers. It stood in the glass, its eyes dark and hollow, its lips twisted into a cruel smile. The shadows around it writhed, coiling around its limbs, pulling it deeper into the mirror, but it did not resist. It simply stared at her, that terrible grin widening, as if it was amused by her efforts. "You can't bind what doesn't want to be bound," the reflection whispered, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "You can't trap what is already free." Mia's hands shook, the knife slipping from her grasp, clattering to the floor. "No," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "No, I did the ritual. The ritual?" The reflection said, and it laughed again, a hollow, empty sound that sent chills down her spine. "The ritual was never to bind me. It was to release me." Mia felt the room spin, her mind reeling. She scrambled to her feet, trying to back away, but her legs felt heavy, as if something was holding her in place. The shadows stretched out from the mirror, twisting around her ankles, creeping up her legs, cold and slick against her skin. She could feel them pulling her, dragging her closer, and she struggled, but it was like fighting against a tide. The reflection's grin widened and its eyes seemed to darken, black pools that swallowed the light. "Did you think I would let you trap me again? Did you think I would stay in that glass waiting for you to find a way to lock me away? No, Mia. I've been waiting for someone to find me, to finish what Blackwood started. And you..." It tilted its head and she saw her own face, twisted and wrong, staring back at her. "You brought me out." Mia's pulse thundered in her ears, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. The shadows were everywhere now, crawling up her arms, wrapping around her throat, choking the air from her lungs. She felt cold, so cold, and the darkness was pressing in, suffocating her, pulling her deeper into itself. "Let go," the reflection whispered, its voice soft, almost tender. "Let me in. You've been fighting for so long, but it's over now. You're tired. Just let go." Mia's vision blurred, the edges of the room fading, swallowed by the encroaching dark. She could see herself in the mirror, see the shadows coiling around her, dragging her into the glass. But she wasn't afraid anymore. There was a strange, terrible peace in the darkness, a cold comfort that seeped into her bones, numbing the pain. And as she looked into the mirror, she saw her reflection smile, a slow, gentle smile, as if it was welcoming her home. "It will be quick," it said, "and then we will be free." The last thing Mia saw was the mirror, cracked and splintered, her reflection fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. The shadows closed around her, and the world went black. In the stillness that followed, the mirror stood silent, its surface smooth and unbroken, as if the crack had never been there. The candles had burned out, their wax pools hardened and cold, and the room was dark, empty, the air thick with the scent of smoke and blood. For a long moment, nothing moved. But then, slowly, the glass began to shimmer, a faint, dark shape twisting beneath the surface, like a shadow drifting through murky water. And from the darkness, a hand pressed against the glass, delicate and pale, followed by a face, a familiar face with eyes that were no longer empty, but filled with something dark and hungry. The reflection smiled, and it was Mia's smile, but not quite. It was too wide, too bright, like a mask that didn't fit. It leaned forward, pressing its lips against the glass, and whispered softly, almost lovingly, "We're free now." The mirror stood in the empty room, its surface dark and still, reflecting nothing but shadows. And somewhere in the depths of the glass, a whisper echoed, faint and distant, as if carried by a breathless wind. "It's not over yet.